Settle back in your chair, loosen the reins of the day, and feel the porch boards under your boots. For the next 100+ minutes, lantern-lit yarns from the Wild West frontier will drift past like a slow desert breeze, easy, warm, and wide as the open range. Breathe deep, friend, the stories begin now. In the burning summer of 1885, long before Arizona became a state, the Pritchett family worked a lonely farm on the southern edge of the Arizona Territory, just a day's ride north of the Mexican border. The land around their cabin looked like an ocean of sand, rocks, and stubby cactus. During the day, the sun felt close enough to touch. At night, the sky glittered with more stars than any city kid had ever seen. The family grew sorghum, a tall grass that could handle heat and drought. When the stalks were squeezed in Pa's noisy cane mill, sweet brown syrup dripped out, thick enough to spread on cornbread. The Pritchetts had 6 daughters. Rose was 30, Daisy 28, Lily 26, Iris 24, Violet 22, and Fern 18. They owned 1 milk cow, 2 horses, a speckled rooster, and a small herd of rangy cattle that wandered the scrub. To keep those cattle from straying too far, Pa had stretched shiny new barbed wire along the north side of the farm. Wood was scarce in the desert, so every strand of wire needed a cedar post hammered deep into the ground to hold it upright. One bright Monday morning, Rose, the eldest and most serious sister, decided their fence needed special attention. She announced at breakfast, "I'm going to count every post on the north line. If one is missing, the cows could slip through, and none of us want to chase animals into the desert." Daisy giggled and asked whether the posts would start chatting back. Rose only smiled, tied her sunbonnet tight, and filled a dented canteen with water. She tucked a stubby pencil behind her ear and grabbed a small leather notebook. Rose's plan sounded dull, but it mattered. Back then, a broken fence could mean days of extra work rounding up cattle. Counting posts was her way of protecting the whole family. At first light, she trudged to the very first post, rubbed its rough cedar surface, and wrote the number 1 in her book. A soft breeze carried the buzz of cicadas. By the time she reached post 17, 2 black grackles were squabbling on the wire. At post 38, she wiped sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, took a long swallow of warm water, and kept going. While Rose marched along the fence, her sisters followed their usual routines back at the cabin. Daisy lit the cook stove and fried cornmeal mush for breakfast. Lily and Fern milked the cow, careful to shoo away a curious calf. Iris gathered brown eggs from the dusty henhouse, then mixed them into a loaf of bread that would bake slowly all morning. Violet hauled 2 buckets of water from the well and scrubbed clothes on a ridged washboard, humming an old church song. Pa inspected the sorghum field, clipping weeds with a dull hoe. By noon, the sun glared straight overhead. Waves of heat shimmered above the desert floor, making distant rocks look like rippling water. Rose reached post 64, felt her legs ache, and decided that was far enough for day 1. As she turned for home, the wind flipped the pages of her notebook as if cheering her on. That night, the family ate bean stew, sweetened with sorghum syrup. Fern begged Rose to read her tally aloud. Rose cleared her throat and called out, 64 sturdy posts. Fern clapped. Violet, still mending a ripped sleeve, raised an eyebrow. Pa nodded once, the highest praise he usually gave, and said, "Good work. Those cattle won't slip past us." Rose slept in the loft, feeling a small glow of pride. At dawn the next morning, Rose set out again. The air smelled of creosote bushes still damp from a rare night mist. She started at post 65 and soon noticed a hole dug by coyotes under post 72. She marked the damage in her notebook so Pa could pack dirt around the base later. Post 79 leaned sideways like a tired soldier. Rose gave it a testing shove, decided it would survive another year, and moved on. Her pencil scratched numbers while the desert hummed with insects. Back at the cabin, chores rolled on. Violet boiled laundry in soapy water, using a paddle to stir the heavy cloth. Daisy mixed flour and lard into pie crust. Lily patched the roof where a spring storm had torn off tar paper. Iris cleaned the kerosene lamps so their glass chimneys would shine bright after sundown. Every job mattered, even if none sounded exciting. Around mid-afternoon, thick gray clouds piled up over distant hills and grumbled with thunder. Lightning forked across the sky, but not a drop of rain reached the farm. Rose hurried, counting faster, scribbling 112, 113, 114 as warm wind tugged at her bonnet. She reached post 127 just as fat raindrops finally began to patter the dust. Laughing with relief, she jogged home, her skirts snapping in the sudden breeze. Supper that night was sweet cornbread, goat cheese from a neighbor, and Daisy's sorghum pie. Rose shared her new total, 127 posts. Pa raised his tin cup and said, "Tomorrow you might even finish." Fern clinked cups with him in playful salute. Wednesday dawned crystal clear, the storm having swept the air clean. Rose felt both tired and excited. She tucked an extra biscuit into her pocket, fuel for the final push, and promised herself she would not stop until she counted every last post. Then she spotted another post, half hidden by a greasewood bush, shorter, older, but still holding wire. Her stomach dipped. 201. It ruined the tidy number she had imagined. For a moment she thought about ignoring the extra post, but the truth was right there in plain sight. Rose opened a fresh page and wrote the number 1 again. She would start a new, cleaner tally the very next morning. The desert sky glowed orange, then purple. As she walked home, the first stars blinked on overhead. Counting, she realized, wasn't really about finishing. It was about paying close attention, giving the land the respect it deserved. That evening, Fern eagerly asked, "How many posts, Rose?" Rose smiled, dust still on her cheeks, and said, "Ask me in a few more days." Pa chuckled and tipped his hat, though he was already indoors. The simple sound of his laugh told Rose her work was worth doing. Outside, 201 fence posts stood silent guard across the desert edge. Tomorrow, and maybe the next day, too, she would count them all again. On the frontier, small chores held great power. They kept cattle safe, guided daughters home, and gave a family one more reason to hope under that wide Arizona sky. The sun slid over the eastern hills like a copper coin, spilling light on the Pritchett homestead and painting every cactus along the dry wash of fiery gold. It was July of 1885, when this land was still called the Arizona Territory and the nearest railroad lay 2 hard days away. Most mornings began with Pa stirring embers in the cook stove and the 6 Pritchett sisters tugging on worn boots. Yet this one carried a spark of excitement. Fern, the youngest at 18, burst onto the porch holding a wicker basket heaped with ears of fresh-picked corn. Behind her came the sweet smell of sorghum syrup. Yesterday's boil still clung to the air, but Fern's grin was brighter than any fragrance. "I'm going to shuck every ear before the supper bell rings," she declared. Her ribbon, the same red as desert sunrise, bounced on her braid. Rose, 30 and steady as the cedar fence posts she had counted last week, lifted an eyebrow. "That's nearly 2 full bushels, little sis." "That's right," Fern said, chin high. Daisy laughed over the mixing bowl. "The husks will itch you raw, but have at it." Pa sipped coffee thick enough to hold a spoon upright. His smile hid under a gray mustache. "Steady hands and steady spirit," he said, which was Pa's way of giving permission. Fern set the basket on a low bench in the porch shade. The porch faced north, away from the fiercest glare, but the desert heat would still crawl there by mid-morning. She filled a dented canteen at the rain barrel. Last week's cloudburst had left it half full, a blessing in a region where some creeks flowed only a few weeks each year, and got to work. "Shuck, pull, twist, snap," she murmured, setting a rhythm like a tune on the pump organ. Husks flew into a growing pile that smelled of green leaves and sun-warmed silk. Kernels, packed in neat yellow rows, dropped into a wooden crate. 20 cobs became 30, then 40, and Fern felt light, as mesquite pollen riding the breeze. Inside, the cabin life marched according to frontier habit. Daisy fried strips of bacon, saving the drippings in a tin can. They would flavor beans later. Iris polished the smoky glass chimneys of kerosene lamps so they would shine clear after sunset. Violet bent over the washboard, humming a hymn while she scrubbed dust from shirts. Lily saddled the mare, planning to ride the northern pasture and scare jackrabbits away from the sorghum. Rose, notebook in hand, checked the feed sacks stacked against the barn wall. Each task looked small, yet together they kept the farm breathing. Outside, Fern reached the end of the first basket just as the sun climbed higher. By late morning, the ground glittered with heat waves. The Arizona territory, wide and mostly empty of trees, could roast a skillet at midday. Fern wiped sweat with her forearm. Corn silk clung to her skin like spider threads. She took a long drink from the canteen, water now warm but still precious, and kept counting aloud. 61, 62. A gust of hot wind swept across the yard, and loose husks fluttered off the porch like green paper birds. Iris poked her head out, saw the mess, and hammered 4 stakes into the bare ground, stringing a rope between them to form a husk-catching fence. Fern flashed her a grateful grin, but did not slow her hands. By noon, Daisy's iron triangle clanged, calling everyone to the table. The smell of fresh cornbread drifted through the doorway, rich with sorghum sweetener. Fern's belly grumbled louder than the rooster, yet she shook her head. "I can't stop." "Not yet," she called out. Rose appeared with a pitcher of cool well water. "Drink at least," she urged. Fern gulped 2 tin cups and went back to work. In her mind, she pictured Pa nodding with quiet pride, and that image pushed her past the itch creeping down her neck. The sun, straight overhead now, shrank her shadow to a puddle at her boots. Her fingers cramped. A small nick opened on her knuckle where the thin knife slipped. She wrapped it with a scrap of cloth torn from her pocket. The cloth soon turned yellow with corn juice, but the cut no longer stung. She kept repeating her chant, shuck, pull, twist, snap, until the words blended with the hum of cicadas hiding in the prickly pear patch. Mid-afternoon drifted in on a slow, baking breeze. The laundry flapped stiff as boards on the line, and the mare flicked flies in the corral. Fern's canteen was nearly empty when Violet tiptoed out and placed a tin cup of lemonade on the porch rail without saying a word. The lemonade was cool, thanks to a chunk of melted ice from last winter's snow kept deep in the root cellar. Fern savored the tart sugar and felt her spirits lift again. Only 10 ears remained. Fern counted them down as if launching fireworks. 10, 9, 8, each one lighter than the last. When she reached 2, her knife slipped again, but this time she felt nothing but determination. 1, she whispered, twisting the final husk free. She leaned back, arms trembling, satisfied to her bones. A soft thump sounded behind her. She turned and spotted another basket half hidden beneath a wash tub. 20 ears she had overlooked. For a long second her heart sagged like an empty water pouch. Then a laugh burst out of her. "You sneaky rascals," she said. Orange evening light poured over the porch while she rolled up her sleeves once more. 15 minutes later the last husk landed on the pile. She swept the porch boards clean, tucked her knife into her belt, and carried 3 bulging crates of corn into the cool shade of the smokehouse to dry on wire racks. The smokehouse smelled of juniper wood and past hams, and Fern inhaled the rich scent like victory. Supper waited inside. A skillet of sorghum-sweet cornbread, a pot of beans, and slices of crisp bacon saved from breakfast. The family gathered around the long pine table, lantern light flickering against log walls. Pa looked across at Fern, whose cheeks still glowed from heat and pride. "All done?" he asked, gentle but measuring. Fern lifted her chin, ribbon dangling loose, and said, "Every single ear. 5 hours and a handful of minutes." Her voice wobbled, half from fatigue and half from joy. Pa reached across the table, squeezed her shoulder, and said only, "Good, honest work." That was praise enough. The sisters cheered, clapped, and shoved the biggest piece of cornbread toward her plate. Later, with dishes washed and stars pricking the sky as bright as lantern sparks. Fern stepped onto the porch. Night air carried the scent of creosote bushes stirred by a distant breeze. Coyotes yipped far off, maybe marking their own victories. Fern's arms ached, but the ache felt right, like muscles growing stronger. She gazed west where the last of the sun had fallen behind the black basalt ridge and whispered, "Small chores keep a big world steady." In the quiet that followed, she heard the land breathe and knew tomorrow would bring fresh work, fresh heat. And somewhere in the middle of it all, another chance to prove herself under the wide frontier sky. A red dawn seeped across the desert and brushed the Pritchett cabin with the color of embers. Summer of 1885 had settled over the Arizona territory, and each morning the air felt still enough to hold its breath. The family rose early to beat the heat. Pa stoked the fire for coffee. Rose stepped outside to watch for storm clouds that rarely came, and Daisy, 28, flower dust already on her hands, tied on her favorite calico dress, green sprigged with tiny white blossoms. A traveling peddler had traded the cloth months ago in exchange for 2 jars of Pa's sorghum syrup, and Daisy loved it because it made her feel as bright as a spring sprout in a land of browns and grays. She was reaching for the coffee tin when her fingers brushed her bodice and paused. A button was gone, the third one down, leaving a neat, empty eyelet where the fabric gaped. Daisy frowned. Buttons weren't simple trinkets here. Freight wagons passed only every few months on the trail between Tucson and Mesilla, and goods cost hard coin. Mother-of-pearl buttons like these had likely started their journey by steamer from the Gulf of Mexico, crossed Texas in a rattling boxcar, and bumped into Arizona by mule team. Losing one felt like letting a silver dollar slip through a crack. Daisy touched the other 5 buttons, counting them as if they were chicks. She could cook without that button, certainly, but the gap would annoy her all day, and she hated a half-done job. She decided, right then, that breakfast could wait while she hunted. Rose, grinding coffee beans, watched her sister drop to hands and knees on the pine floorboards. "Lose something?" Rose asked. "My Pearly," Daisy answered, voice muffled. "Can't stand a missing piece." Rose knew that tone. Daisy was as stubborn about her kitchen as Rose was about fences, so she simply set the grindstone aside and began moving chairs. The search spread like a slow sunrise. Iris fetched the kerosene lamp to shine light into the dark crack between hearthstones. Violet lifted the rag rug. Fern crawled beneath the long pine table, coming up with nothing but biscuit crumbs. Outside, Pa ran a hand along the corral rail and wondered what new scheme had seized his daughters before dawn. The cabin floor held years of frontier history. Dust from wagon wheels, stray grains of sorghum, the odd bead from a Sunday bonnet. Daisy sifted through all of it. She checked her apron pocket. Only a bent hairpin. She retraced last night's steps, remembering how she'd carried a pail of water from the well, how she'd ladled stew into bowls, how she'd stood on the porch and watched lightning flicker over the distant Huachuca Mountains. The memory of that dry lightning made her glance at the porch boards, sun-bleached and split by heat. She slipped outside, still in her stocking feet. Morning light bounced off the hardpan yard. A jackrabbit twitched behind a barrel cactus. The porch boards offered 100 narrow gaps perfect for hiding a small round button. Daisy stretched out flat and peered between the planks. She saw spider webs, a forgotten horseshoe nail, something that might have been a marble once, but no glimmer of polished shell. Lily rode in from the north lot just then, dust curling behind her horse's hooves. "Pa's cow is calving," she announced, swinging down. Anyone seen the midwife, the one in a calico dress with her head under the porch? Daisy scooted back, brushing grit from her elbows. "I'll help in a minute. Lost a thing of beauty." "No button's worth missing a berth," Lily teased, but Daisy only squared her shoulders. "Buttons keep dresses shut and cooks decent. Can't stir cornmeal half-dressed." Lily laughed and led the mare to water. The territory bred patient humor. Every sister understood that a day's chore list always stretched longer than daylight, so arguments were wisps of cloud, there and gone. Inside, heat from the stove crept outward even though no breakfast cooked yet. Iris opened the back door for a breeze that never showed. Violet, kneeling by the woodbox, lifted each splintered stick and examined the floor beneath. She talked softly about the merits of bone buttons versus shell, How Bowen held die better, but Shell caught the light. By mid-morning, the sun hammered the roof shingles, and Pa's cow had delivered a healthy red calf. Fern carried news of the birth, along with a suggestion. Maybe the button rolled into the ash bucket? Daisy, cheeks flushed, seized the idea. She dumped the cold ashes onto the ground behind the smokehouse and sifted with her fingers, gray dust puffing around her like winter mist. Still nothing. She thought of the path to the root cellar. Last evening she'd fetched a jar of pickled okra. Perhaps the button dropped then. Down the ladder, she went into the cool, earth-scented dark. Shells of canned peaches and string beans glimmered in lantern light. She scanned the packed dirt floor. A spider scurried. A mouse hole yawned. No button. Climbing back up, Daisy sat on the cellar step and pressed her palms to her temples. Across the yard, the cattle lazed under a mesquite's thready shade, tails flicking flies. Beyond them rose low basalt ridges baked black by centuries of sun. Those rocks had outlasted Spanish trails and Apache raids, and would outlast Pritchett worries too. The thought steadied her breath. She stood, brushed her skirt, and walked to the wash line where yesterday evening she'd hung the very dress she wore now. At the foot of the line lay a small mound of caliche dust kicked up by horses. Something white winked from its crest. Daisy knelt, and her fingers closed on a smooth round disc, a bit dull from grit, but undeniably her button. She laughed, a bright bubble of sound that drifted toward the cabin. Nobody heard her over the rooster's crow, yet the land seemed to pause, as if pleased to return what it had borrowed. She hurried inside. Violet threaded a needle with blue cotton, waxing the thread against a candle stub for strength. Daisy settled at the table, hands finally still, and stitched the button back into its proper place. Every tug of the needle felt like tying a knot in the day, drawing loose hours into order. When she finished, she fastened the row top to bottom, smoothed the fabric, and nodded. Pa stepped through the door, sweat darkening his collar. "Breakfast yet?" he asked, voice light but hopeful. "Almost," Daisy said, rising. "Had to mend the cook first." She tied her apron afresh, sprinkled cornmeal into the skillet, and set bacon to sizzling. The rich smell rolled through the room, stirring empty stomachs. As the family gathered, Fern whispered, "All that for one tiny circle?" "All that," Daisy echoed, eyes soft. "Because on this edge of nowhere, tiny circles hold big things together." The sisters passed plates, and Pa murmured grace. Outside, the desert shimmered, indifferent to buttons and breakfasts alike. But inside the cabin there was harmony restored. A calico dress made whole, a family fed, and the long frontier day finally allowed to begin. A pale sunrise found the scrub flat glowing silver, and by the time the first cicada chirred, Lily Pritchett was already in the yard, boot-toe tapping the sagging front gate to test the hinge. It was August 1885, still nearly 3 decades before Arizona would join the Union, and metal out here rusted faster than gossip. The gate framed the only opening in the barbed wire fence that circled the cabin yard, and every time it swung shut it let out a squeal high enough to startle chickens clear across the mesquite patch. Ma had once called the noise a coyote's violin, and Lily, 26 and proud caretaker of anything with a latch, had finally decided she would silence it for good. The farm sat a day's ride northwest of the little town of Tombstone, though most weeks the family went nowhere. Wagons rattled past maybe twice a month, one heading to Tucson, one bound for Fort Huachuca with army supplies. Hardware stores were distant dreams, so tools were prized like silver dollars. Lily carried Pa's only oil can, an old beef tallow tin punched with a spout, plus a rag, a dented coffee mug of cloudy kerosene, and a sliver of soap scraped from Violet's laundry block. The sun was still low, but even that gentle light promised heat to come. By noon it would bounce off the basalt hills hard enough to make the horizon wiggle. She eased the gate open. It screamed like a barn cat on the doctor's table, the cry spinning up into the sky. Lily winced, then smiled. "You just told me where it hurts," she said, voice softer than the breeze that stirred her loose braid. She knelt to study the hinges. 2 iron straps hugged a cedar post bleached, almost white by years of sun. The bottom strap had worn a groove where metal met metal, and the weight of the gate sagged so that the latch scraped the post. Simple problem, she thought. Simple as honest. Inside the cabin, coffee bubbled. Rose added a pine stick to the fire. Daisy whisked eggs, and Fern was still rubbing sleep from her eyes. Iris stepped out onto the porch to ask how long breakfast might take. She planned to check her homemade windmill for loose bolts before the day grew windy, but Lily waved her off. No sense eating until the gate can close quiet, she called. Iris, used to her sister's stubborn streak, returned inside shaking her head. Lily's first trick was soap. She rubbed the slick bar along the hinge pins, coating them in a thin film. She pushed the gate forward. Squeak. Pulled it back. Squeak. Only a little softer. Soap alone wouldn't do. She lifted the oil can, tilted it, and a single drop of black gold slid down the spout. She guided it onto the top hinge, then pumped the gate again. The squeak dropped half an octave, but still whined like a fiddle string out of tune. She remembered Pa's lesson. Oil helps, but tight wood helps more. If a hinge pin wobbled, it scraped no matter how slick. She searched the yard for a wedge and spotted a splintered slat that had fallen from the corral. With her pocket knife, she whittled a thin shim, slid it behind the strap, and hammered it in with the heel of her hand. Dust puffed up. She tried the gate. Almost quiet, yet a faint chirp remained, a sound just sharp enough to bother her. A buzzard drifted overhead, lazy as the rising heat. From the south pasture came lowing. Pa and Violet were coaxing the milk cow toward the shade of a velvet mesquite, the calf trotting after like a child late for school. Farther out, the sorghum field rustled, tall canes swaying in the slight morning wind. Daily life moved on while Lily chased perfection. She unhooked the gate, lifted it off its hinges, and laid it on 2 wooden blocks. It was heavier than it looked, each plank fastened by square nails black with age. Kneeling in the dust, she drove the hinge pins out with a punch. A broken horseshoe nail served, then polished them on her rag until they shone like gun barrels. She mixed kerosene with a pinch of soft lard. Nothing beats pig fat for staying put, Pa always said, and smeared the paste into the hinge knuckles. When she slid the pins back, they seated with a dull, satisfied clunk. She heaved the gate upright and balanced its weight while she guided the hinges home. One last push, and it swung free, silent as a desert owl. She shut it again, half disbelieving. No squeak, only the click of the latch and the hush of morning wind. She opened and closed it 10 times, faster each round, but it kept its peace. A trace of oil dripped onto her boot. She wiped it away, grinning. Breakfast smells drifted out the open windows, corn griddle cakes and bacon. Lily ducked inside, face streaked with sweat but eyes bright. Gates tamed, she said, dropping the rag in a pail of wash water. Rose handed her a tin plate. You saved our ears, she replied. Daisy slid 2 cakes onto Lily's plate, adding a drizzle of sorghum syrup fresh from yesterday's boil. Fern clapped once, a small celebration. They ate with windows propped wide to catch a thin breeze. Lily swallowed a bite and listened. No squeal, no scrape, only the muted buzz of insects and the thump of Pa's boots as he stepped onto the porch. He opened the gate and shut it again, head cocked like a curious crow. Quiet as Sunday, he said at last. Looks like hinges just needed a steady hand. Lily shrugged, cheeks warming. Nothing fancy, soap, oil, and a shim. Pa nodded approval, the highest honor in his book, and went to draw water for the stock. Iris fetched her tools and trotted off toward her windmill. Daisy washed dishes, Rose recorded the day's chores in her ledger. Violet planned to patch a saddle blanket, and Fern practiced him tunes on the pump organ, small notes floating through the open door. The sun climbed, heat waves shimmered above the yard, and life on the Pritchett farm slid forward, one quiet hinge at a time. That afternoon, Lily saddled her pony for a ride to the west boundary, and when she returned at dusk, the gate greeted her with a gentle click instead of a shriek. Bats skimmed the purple sky, catching moths, and far-off thunder rumbled where summer storms brewed over the Santa Rita Mountains. The desert would always have its wild noises, coyote yips, wind keening through arroyos. But thanks to a tin of oil, a sliver of soap, and a woman who refused to accept a squeak, the Pritchett porch reclaimed a pocket of calm. She leaned on the gatepost, listening to the hush she had earned, and thought about how small labors often held the homestead together. A counted fence, a mended button, a shucked field of corn, and now a silent hinge. Under the velvet sky, she felt the territory stretch around her, wide and raw and waiting. And she knew that tomorrow's dawn would bring another task and another chance to wrestle order from the wild. Dawn crept over the Arizona territory like a slow-pouring stream of pale gold, slipping between mesquite branches and into the single window of the Pritchett kitchen. The year was 1885, still 27 summers before Arizona would earn its star on the flag, and most mornings began the same way. Pa threw 2 cedar logs into the stove, Rose checked the sky for storm signs, and Daisy laid out tin bowls for breakfast. On this morning, Iris, the 4th sister at 24, slipped in ahead of everyone, carrying a stoneware jar sealed tight with wax. She moved quietly, yet the floorboards whispered under her boots. Iris had spent the previous afternoon climbing a rough-barked ironwood tree half a mile south, following the low hum of wild bees. The bees had tucked their honeycomb in a hollow branch, and after a smoky fire drove them off, Iris had scooped out thick amber honey and carried it home wrapped in damp cloth to keep the desert dust away. Now, with sunlight barely touching the eastern ridge, she set the jar on the worn cedar counter and untied the wax lid. Honey glowed inside like liquid topaz. Most mornings the family ate cornmeal mush. Some folks called it porridge, sweetened with sorghum syrup they boiled themselves. Sorghum was trusty. Cane grew even when rains failed, and the syrup kept through winter. But Iris liked tinkering. She had once turned a junk wagon wheel into a spinning clothes-drying rack, and another time she built a wind vane out of turkey feathers. Today her experiment lived in the stew pot. She ladled water into the cast iron pot, sprinkled in fine yellow cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and set it on the stove grate where the first flames licked blue. While the mush thickened, she warmed a spoonful of honey against the side of the pot so it would pour smooth. The sweet smell drifted around the room, richer than sorghum, lighter than molasses. She grinned, imagining her sisters' amazed faces. Rose stepped in, the edge of her counting ledger tucked under one arm. "Smells different," she said, sniffing the air. "Just stirring early." Iris replied, keeping her secret. Daisy followed, still tying her apron. "I dreamed of flapjacks," she yawned, "but mush will do." Lily stamped snow dust sand from her boots. She had been out checking the quiet gate Lily had fixed days ago, then fetched 7 tin bowls from the shelf. Violet brought the rag rug to shake outside. Fern hummed to him while setting spoons. Pa entered last, brushing straw from his sleeves after a sunrise visit to the calf pen. Steam curled from the pot in lazy white ribbons. Iris added the honey with a flourish, stirring until the golden ribbon disappeared into the bubbling cornmeal. She cut the fire back, letting breakfast settle into a slow blurp-blurp rhythm. Pa poured coffee, so strong it left rings on the spoon. "Something new in the pot?" he asked. Iris lifted a brow. "Just wait and see." When the mush reached the right creamy heft, she ladled it into waiting bowls, a dash of milk on top of each. Everyone settled around the long pine table nicked by years of knives and elbows. Outside, the sky was warming to a bright turquoise, and a cactus wren chattered near the water barrel. The family bent over their bowls. Tin spoons clinked. Everyone took a first bite. Rose ate, nodded once without comment, and turned a page in her ledger as if numbers mattered more than flavors. Daisy savored a spoonful, paused, then shrugged and reached for the salt shaker. Lily chased a raisin through the mush, tasting, frowning thoughtfully, but said nothing. Violet murmured a polite mm, exactly the noise she made every morning. Fern finished half her bowl in 5 rapid scoops, smiled at Iris, and asked if there might be more. Iris's grin dimmed to a puzzled twitch. She cleared her throat. Doesn't anyone notice anything special? Daisy looked up. Eggs are missing, but otherwise it's fine. No, the sweet. Iris leaned forward. I swapped the sorghum for honey from a wild hive. I climbed that ironwood for nearly an hour yesterday. She waited for surprise, for applause, for any spark. Pa lifted his eyebrows a fraction, the way he did when cattle prices changed. Honey's good food, he said, though can't say I tasted much change. Mighty pleasant either way. Fern spooned another bite, thinking, tastes sweet. I like sweet. For a moment Iris felt like air leaking from a bellows. She had pictured cheers, maybe Violet begging for her secret, perhaps even Pa declaring the best porridge since Kansas. Instead she received mild nods and empty bowls. She slumped back, then caught herself. Experimenting was its own reward. Ma used to say when soap failed to set or seeds refused to sprout. You learn something whether it works or not. Iris straightened. Honey cost me 1 scraped knee and 3 bee stings, she said with a small laugh. Next time I'll leave the syrup as it is. At least the bees can keep their breakfast. Rose closed her ledger. If you need fresh cane, I'll help cut tomorrow, she offered, knowing kindness traveled fastest when unannounced. The morning hurried on. Pa left to mend a water trough. Lily saddled the mare to ride fence. Rose carried her notebook to the barn loft where cool shade waited. Daisy washed bowls at the pump, humming a tune she learned from a traveling fiddler. Iris cleaned the pot, sticky with honey at the rim, and set the jar on a shelf beside the sorghum jug, 2 sugars standing side by side. Neither better, both useful. Outside, heat shimmered over the flat, and a distant dust devil twirled across the barren playa. Life on the edge of the Sonoran Desert demanded patience. Crops grew slow, rains came late, and sometimes a bold new porridge tasted exactly like the old one. Yet the land still rewarded curiosity. Iris wiped her hands on her skirt, scanned the yard for her next project, and noticed Rose's broken measuring stick leaning against the porch post. She picked it up, eyeing the splintered end, and smiled. The day had plenty of room for another idea. Evening settled on the Pritchett farm like a soft blanket, stars blinking awake while the last glow of sunset faded behind the basalt hills. The year was 1885, back when this part of the Sonoran Desert was still called the Arizona Territory, and lanterns, not electric bulbs, pushed back the dark. The day's heat slid away, leaving a quiet hush broken only by the buzz of cicadas and the distant call of a night bird. Inside the cabin, 7 shadows gathered around the pine table, each one stretching long across the plank floor in the flicker of a single kerosene lamp. Violet, 22 and proud keeper of all things stitched, held a tiny sewing needle between her thumb and forefinger. A scrap of calico lay on the table, a torn sleeve from Fern's work dress that needed mending before morning chores. The problem was simple enough. Night had come early thanks to a bank of clouds, and the cabin's one good lamp sputtered with weak light. In that dim glow, the eye of the needle looked no bigger than a gnat's mouth. Yet Violet was determined. She pushed a length of white cotton thread through a ball of beeswax to tame the frays, then lifted it toward the glitter of the needle's opening. The thread bent like a tired stem and missed. She tried again, and again. Each attempt drew a soft breath from her sisters, who sat nearby the way folks sit on a church pew, quiet, hands folded, but unable to look away. Pa leaned against the doorframe, jacket thrown over one shoulder after feeding the stock. "Need more lamp oil?" he asked. Violet shook her head. "Need steadier hands, that's all." Rose, eldest at 30, smoothed a corner of her ledger. "Steady hands and good light make half the work," she advised, but Violet hardly heard. Her whole world had shrunk to needle, thread, and small circle of lamplight. Beyond the window, the desert whispered. A breeze rattled dry mesquite pods, and far off a coyote yipped to its kin. The Pritchett farm lay roughly a day's ride west of Tombstone, a dusty trail away from any true town. Freight wagons passed maybe twice a month, so even a spool of thread was worth the care of gold. If Violet failed tonight and frayed the cotton beyond use, the dress might stay torn until the next wagon arrived with supplies. That thought steadied her resolve. She licked the thread's end, flattened the fibers, squinted, and tried again. Miss. Fern, perched on the bench beside her, counted under her breath. That was 9. Fern's freshly mended dress flapped slightly whenever a breeze slipped through the window gaps. Daisy, apron still dusted with flour from supper biscuits, fetched her darning needle, a size larger, and placed it near Violet's elbow. If you can't thread the small one, use mine for basting, she offered. Violet smiled, appreciating the kindness, but nudged the larger needle back. Fern's sleeve is thin cotton. A big needle leaves big holes. Attempt 10. The thread bent like straw. Miss. Lily blew gently across the lamp chimney to clear soot from the glass. The glow brightened a shade, but still the eye of the needle seemed to vanish whenever Violet moved it. Outside, the half-moon rose, painting the yard silver. Inside, the air smelled of kerosene and warm pine. Pa fetched a second lamp from the storage shelf, but its wick was too short, burned nearly to the brass collar. Dry as a bone, he declared, setting it aside. Iris, ever the tinkerer, offered a different suggestion. Hold the needle against a scrap of white cloth, she said. I will show clearer than against wood. Violet placed the needle atop a folded flour sack, pale against pale. Attempt 11, 12, 13. Miss. Rose's ledger lay closed now. Even she was caught by the gentle drama. Each time the thread slipped past the needle's eye, a hush settled, as if the whole family exhaled together. Somewhere around attempt 15, the coyote chorus rose again, and Pa stepped outside to make sure the henhouse latch was firm. By try 20, Daisy set a cup of cool well water near Violet's hand. Sip, she said. Shaking hands can't hit a small target. Violet drank, the water sweet with traces of limestone. She drew a slow breath, rolled her shoulders, and dabbed sweat from her brow with the hem of her sleeve. The lamp guttered, throwing shadows that danced across the ceiling beams. Lily fetched a sliver of extra wick from her pocket. She'd trimmed the saddle lantern earlier and coaxed it into the lamp's burner. The flame steadied, brightened. The needle, resting on white cloth, flashed a tiny circle of reflected light. Attempt 25. The thread caught the rim, bowed, slipped free. Attempt 30. The sisters leaned forward. Violet's lips moved in silent count. The thread grazed the hole, refused entry. Rose whispered, "Patience is the frontier's best tool." Violet's fingers steadied as if listening. She pinched the thread shorter, leaving only a whisper of cotton extending beyond her fingertips, then slowed her breath the way Pa did before lining up a fence staple. Attempt 37. The point of thread kissed the needle's eye, glided through, pulled clear to the other side. For a heartbeat, Violet didn't move, hardly dared to blink. Then she drew the thread halfway, folded it, and tugged gently until it hung double through the metal. Success! Fern clapped, a quick spatter of sound in the quiet room. Daisy let out a low, "Well, look at that." Lily grinned, so wide the lamp glinted on her teeth. Even Rose tapped the table once in applause. Pa re-entered just then, catching the tale of celebration. "What's the news?" he asked, wiping dust from his hat brim. "I met thread on number 37, Violet announced, cheeks glowing with equal parts victory and relief. Pa tipped his hat. Shows what stubborn focus can earn. He settled into his chair, listening as the family exhaled. With needle readied, Violet stitched Fern's sleeve with tiny, even passes. The calico mended under her hands, torn edge disappearing stitch by stitch. Around her, the sisters returned to small chores. Rose copied fence tallies into neat columns. Daisy packed leftover biscuits in a tin. Lily strung her lariat for morning work. Iris tested a wind-up toy she'd carved from mesquite, and Fern practiced chords on Ma's old pump organ. The lamp burned steady now, flame trimmed to a blue core, casting warm gold on log walls. Outside, night settled deep. The Milky Way spilled across the sky, and the desert scent, creosote and cooling stone, flowed in through open windows. Within that quiet, the simple triumph of a threaded needle felt as grand as any gunfight told in dime novels. It proved that patience, good advice, and a bit of sisterly faith could tame even the smallest challenge. When Violet tied off the last knot, she snipped the thread and pressed the seam flat with her thumb. She handed the dress to Fern, whose grin seemed to borrow light from the lamp. "Strong as new," Violet said. Fern slipped the sleeve over her arm. "Better than new," she replied. "Now it has a story sewn in." The family readied for sleep, lantern dimmed, shutters closed against wandering dust. As Violet set her thimble on the shelf, she glanced once more at the tiny needle, already resting for tomorrow's work. Out here on the far rim of the frontier, she thought, a small circle of metal held quite a lot together. Most of all, the steady beating heart of home. The first light of dawn bled across the eastern sky, painting the desert a pale apricot. A rooster's ragged crow drifted from the coop, and the Pritchett household stirred to life as it did every Monday in the late summer of 1885. Monday was wash day, and wash day meant a great deal of water, wood fire, and woman power, all hard to spare in the Arizona territory. Rose, 30 years old and steady as bedrock, stepped onto the porch with her battered straw hat already tied under her chin. Pa followed, mug of scalding coffee in hand. He eyed the pink sky and the thin streaks of cloud far off toward Mexico. "Monsoon season's got a habit of sneaking up," he said. "If storm clouds gather, I want warning before we string a single sheet. Your eyes are sharp. Keep watch." Rose nodded. On the frontier, a sudden rain could undo hours of scrubbing in a blink. Soaked laundry would need to be washed again. Soap would be wasted and precious well water spent twice. Today, she was the official weather lookout. Behind her, the sisters set to their stations like members of a tiny, well-rehearsed orchestra. Violet and Daisy hauled the iron washpot onto a stone ring behind the house. Lily pumped the squeaky handle of the well, filling tin buckets until her shoulders ached. Iris knelt by the firebox, feeding mesquite kindling under the pot. Fern fetched ash soap, gray bars boiled last winter from lard and lye, and stacked them on a stump. Rose climbed the ladder to the barn loft for the widest view. From that perch, she could see the thorny sweep of open range, the low basalt ridges to the west, and, in clear weather, a faint blue fringe of the Whetstone Mountains. She settled on an upside-down crate, opened her ledger to a blank page, and wrote the date in tidy letters. August 24th, 1885. Below, steam began to coil from the washpot as Violet stirred shirts and petticoats with a paddle. Daisy's washboard clattered in its wooden tub. The air smelled of hot soap, damp cotton, and distant creosote bushes warming under the sun. Rose shaded her eyes. A cotton ball cloud drifted lazily overhead, white as a new sheet. No harm there. She scanned the southern horizon, where true monsoon storms usually brood, looking for dark anvils of cloud or the flicker of lightning. Nothing yet. Only a dust devil spinning across the dry wash like a skinny dancer. 10 o'clock brought deeper heat. Ripples of air shimmered above the desert floor until fence posts in the distance wobbled like mirages. Rose made a note. Heat haze strong, sky clear. She remembered Pa's rule from cattle-moving days. Cirrus clouds like horsehair meant fair weather, but a stack of thunderheads after noon was trouble. Right now, the only clouds were high and wispy. Down below, Lily and Fern wrestled a dripping bedsheet onto the clothesline, wooden pins snapping tight. The twins of laundry and weather shared a delicate peace. One always threatened to spoil the other. The sheet bellied in the breeze like a white sail bound for California. Around noon, Daisy called Rose down for a bite, a slice of cold Johnny cake, and a ladle of well water. Rose stood by the washtub while she ate, the cool shade of the ash tree a small mercy in the glaring light. A grasshopper rasped at her boots. Then a sharp pop came from the stove wood as sap blistered. "See anything?" Iris asked, wiping sweat from her brow with a soapy forearm. "Sky looks harmless," Rose replied. But clouds love to fool folks. She climbed back to her lookout as the bell of Pa's hammer rang faintly from the corral. He was patching a loose rail. The desert afternoon lengthened, as slow and heavy as molasses in January. Rose counted 3 more dust devils, their tiny skirts of sand shredding against cactus. Over the mountains to the east, gray smudges hinted at rain falling miles away, but the streaks evaporated before touching the ground. A mirage called virga, common as coyotes out here. By 2 o'clock, thunderheads finally began to stack on the far southern skyline, their tops glowing bright white, their bottoms iron dark. Rose's pulse kicked. She scribbled, "Storm Tower forming south-southwest." She cupped both hands as a makeshift trumpet and hollered down, "Watch the south." Her warning floated across the yard. The sisters paused, peering where she pointed. A few rolled sleeves higher, some quickened their ringing, but the wind kept still and hot. The thunderheads drifted, swelling, then deflated like bellows losing air. After an hour, they thinned into ragged cotton, leaving only blue behind. Fern wagged a playful finger up at Rose. "You cried wolf, sis." Rose shrugged, half sheepish, half relieved. Better a false alarm than soggy linen. She returned to her post, legs dangling over the loft edge, and opened her ledger again. Clouds collapsed, no rain. The sun slanted westward. Clothes dried crisp as parchment. Every shirt flapped a flat applause in the breeze. Daisy collected them, folding while still warm. Violet hummed a hymn as she snapped sheets free of the line. At last, only steam ghosts hovered above the cooling washpot, and shadows stretched long across the yard. Rose clambered down the ladder, her ledger tucked under her arm. Pa stood by the porch, arms folded, surveying the clear sky painted orange by sunset. "Good sentinel work," he said. "Dry wash, dry wood, and not a drop wasted." Rose smiled, wiping dust from her palms. Hours of staring at the horizon had left her eyes gritty, but satisfaction glowed inside her like lamplight. The family marched into the cabin for supper, bean stew with a swirl of sorghum, while twilight deepened and the first stars pierced the sky. After dishes were washed and lanterns lit, Rose stepped back outside. Night air felt cool and sweet, scented with earth still warm from daylight. The sky was an ink-black pond full of diamonds, and not a cloud dared wander across it. She leaned against the porch post, ledger held loose at her side, and listened to the gentle hiss of wind through drying grass. On a frontier that could turn harsh without warning, today's victory was quiet, nearly invisible. Clean clothes, safe firewood, no wasted water, and a notebook full of sky notes. Little wins like that stitched one day to the next, holding the family steady until the next sunrise. Somewhere in the dark a coyote yipped, then another answered, and Rose felt grateful that the only things hung out to dry tonight were linens shining pale in the moonlight. Even before dawn, the cabin smelled of hot tallow and wood smoke. It was late September of 1885, and cool nights had tiptoed into the Arizona territory at last, leaving frost crystals on the sorghum just wide enough to catch the first pale light. Iris rose while the stars were still bright, buttoned her coat against the chill, and carried a bucket of beef fat from the smokehouse to the kitchen stove. Store-bought candles cost more than coffee this far from Tucson, and kerosene had to come by freight wagon, so the Pritchetts lit most evenings with homemade tapers. Plain, greasy things that smoked a little but kept darkness at bay. Inside, Rose fed cedar kindling to the firebox. Sparks leapt like fireflies and the cast iron stove rumbled awake. Daisy measured cornmeal for breakfast cakes, humming low. In a corner, Violet sorted last week's laundry pile, still smelling faintly of lye soap. Iris thanked them all with a nod and set to work, pouring the pale hunks of fat into a rusty bean pot. The fat would melt to liquid tallow, and each sister would take turns dipping wicks as soon as sunlight edged over the porch rail. Pa called it banking light for tomorrow. As the fat softened, Iris shredded an old cotton sheet into rough cords, tying small rocks to one end so the wicks would hang straight in the pot. The cabin warmed fast. Soon the windows fogged with a sheen of grease. Fern opened the door and let in desert air scented with sage. By the time the sun cleared the low basalt ridge, the tallow shimmered milky clear. Iris set the pot on a low bench away from the stove, then trimmed the wicks to equal length. Lily arrived with fresh eggs from the coop and teased, "Mind your skirts. One splash and Paul smell tallow for a week." Iris rolled her eyes but smirked. Mistakes in her projects were legend in the family lore, though rarely serious. The dipping began. Each wick touched the hot tallow, picked up a thin coat, then cooled on a wooden rack before the next dip. Around and around they went, an easy rhythm that filled the kitchen with a soft, meaty perfume. Outside, Pa mended a fence rail. The thud of his hammer set a steady bass line to the sisters' chatter. On the 12th round, Iris tipped the pot just a little to scrape the final spoonfuls from the bottom. The iron lip caught against the bench, and a single glossy gob of hot tallow leapt free, landing square on Rose's ledger where it lay open on the table. Everyone froze. Rose blinked, then pressed 2 fingers to the waxy blob. It was barely larger than a peach pit, already firming in the morning cool. Iris's cheeks flared crimson. "I'm sorry," she blurted, snatching a scrap of muslin. Rose, calm as always, eased the ledger closed, blotting paper to paper, then handed the book back to Iris. "No harm done," she said. "Just a shiny reminder that light costs effort." Iris wiped the smear clean in 3 brisk swipes. The paper held a faint grease crescent, but the inked numbers, the week's grain tally, remained clear. Daisy chuckled and placed a heavy flour sack on the page to press it flat. Crisis, if one could call it that, was over in less than a minute. The dipping resumed. By noon, 3 dozen stubby white candles hung in even rows, and Iris trimmed their wicks to thumb length while Daisy flipped corn cakes on the griddle. The sky outside blazed cobalt, not a cloud anywhere. Violet, catching the scent of melting fat, fetched a tin of crushed juniper berries and dropped a pinch in the still warm pot. The next dip left each candle with a whisper of mountain green fragrance. Afternoon chores scattered the family across the yard. Lily rode fence on her gray mare. Fern practiced him chords on the pump organ. Pa hauled buckets from the well. Rose sharpened the sickle for cutting the last sorghum cane. Iris set the candles on a shelf in the smokehouse to harden, then carried the cool tallow pot to the creek bed and scrubbed it with sand until the iron liner shone black again. When evening drifted in, cool, gentle, dusky rose, the family gathered for supper. Iris sliced ham. Daisy ladled bean stew. Pa gave thanks. After dishes were stacked and the last sliver of sun slipped away, Iris lit one of the new candles. The flame caught, steady and bright, filling the room with a warm amber glow touched by the faint tang of juniper. Rose opened her ledger, finding the page with the grease stain now pressed almost invisible, and began adding figures for tomorrow's chores. She smiled across the lamp at Iris. "Looks like your little splash turned into good light after all." Iris grinned back, the candle casting gold across her face. Outside, coyotes sang from the distant wash, but inside the cabin the tiny flame held its own against the dark, proof that a day's work, even with a small mishap, could still shine exactly as planned. Dawn eased across the Arizona territory like soft lamp oil, pooling gold behind the basalt ridge west of the Pritchett place. Autumn 1885 had cooled the nights, yet the daytime sun still bit hard enough to bleach fence posts and crack adobe. The hens started fussing under their sod-roofed coop long before the rooster found his voice, a jittery chorus that tugged Fern from her pallet in the loft. Egg Money meant coffee beans from Tucson, and coffee meant Pa's temper stayed level through long days of fence repair. So Fern took chicken matters seriously. She crept down the ladder, boots unlaced, and stepped outside into air that smelled of mesquite, ash, and moon-washed dry grass. A pale half-moon still hung over the South Range where Apache Pass cut through low hills. The Pritchett's kept a modest flock. Rhode Island Reds mingled with tough desert game hens. 40-odd birds if last week's count held true. Coyotes prowled the arroyos, and red-tailed hawks traced lazy circles overhead. Both would steal a chicken without ceremony. Fern's task this morning was a full census. She wanted the precise number so Daisy could ration winter feed. Rose could note losses in her ledger, and Pa could judge whether to trade for fresh pullets at next month's Fort Huachuca Supply Fair. She grabbed the tally slate, an old roofing shingle rubbed smooth with lard, and chalk from the kitchen shelf, then crossed the yard. Inside the cabin, Daisy was already rattling the stove damper, Violet finishing the last stitches on Pa's patched trousers. The sisters traded drowsy nods. Real greetings could wait until coffee. Fern reached the coop just as the eastern sky blushed pink. The coop sat against a thorn scrub fence, sturdy but plain, built of scavenged lumber and roofed with scrap canvas tarred against rare rain. She unlatched the door and stepped inside the gloom, the stale warmth of feathers pressing around her. A single kerosene lantern, wick trimmed the night before, hung from a nail, its thin light scattering shadows into fox-shaped suggestions. She chalked a mark every time a hen shuffled past her boots. 1, 2, 3. By 20 her throat warmed with dust. A barred rock hen clucked sharply, offended by the intrusion. Fern apologized under her breath. The rooster strutted last, tail feathers a bold green-black shimmer. She shut the door and added the marks. 43. She frowned. Last week, she'd counted 42. Had she miscounted then? Or did the neighbor's scrawny bantam slip through a gap? She rubbed sleeve across her nose, chalk dust peppering her cuff, and decided to verify. Accuracy mattered. Feed was weighed by the cup, and mistakes multiplied across winter. She circled to the backside run, where wire mesh met hardpan. Sometimes a bird slipped out under the mesh to scratch free ground. She saw only cactus skeletons and yesterday's chicken tracks. The desert lay quiet, save for a lone cicada complaining from a creosote bush. Inside the cabin, Daisy called that corn mush would be ready shortly. Fern signaled she'd come soon, then opened the coop again, determined to repeat the census with daylight brighter now through cracks in the boards. The hens complained but shuffled obligingly. 1, 2, 3, 42. Now she had 2 tallies, one higher, one lower. She sucked her lip. Maybe the second count missed a bird perched in the shadowed rafters. She picked up a short stick and gently tapped the lowest roost. Feathers ruffled, nobody dropped. She moved to the top roost, tapped twice, and a sleepy pullet flapped down in a burst of straw dust. Fern laughed and added a fresh chalk tick. 43 again. Satisfied, she returned to the porch where Pa was pouring coffee thick as sorghum. Daisy's corn mush steamed in tin bowls. Rose-eyed Fern's dusty sleeves. Flock numbers. 43, Fern said, sliding onto the bench. Violet set down her needle. Didn't we have 42 last week? Fern told of the shadow-hidden pullet and her double check. Pa nodded approval. Accuracy in small things showed backbone in larger ones. He opened his worn ledger, penciled 43 hens, 1 rooster, and closed it with a thump. Breakfast chatter drifted to the price of feed corn up in Tucson and rumors of a new stage route skirting their valley. Outside, the sun lifted clear. Its first hot beam bounced off the coop roof, and hens spilled into the run, pecking the ground like miners after gold flakes. Mid-morning found Fern back at the coop, scattering a measured scoop of cracked grain. 1 handful per 10 birds, plus a pinch for the rooster. She watched as beaks clicked and feathers jostled. A small kingdom orderly enough when numbers were known. Across the yard, Lily mounted her gray mare, heading to check a western pasture where storm runoff sometimes carved fresh gullies. Iris tinkered with a wind-driven water pump prototype lashed together from barrel staves. Rose wrote fence repair costs beneath today's hen tally, and Daisy planned which eggs could be spared for the neighbor with the new baby. By noon, heat shivered above the hard soil, and the hens retreated to the narrow shade of the coop wall. Fern leaned against the doorway, chalk slate tucked under her arm, content. 43 seemed a simple truth, but out here simple truths kept a family stitched to the land. 1 missing bird could signal a hole in the wire, a prowler in the night, or a weakness in their own vigilance. Knowing the count let them breathe easy until dusk demanded another head check. Evening would come with copper skies, coyotes testing the dark, and the lantern's thin flame dancing in the coop once more. Fern would count again, chalk ready, because a census, like sunrise, belonged to every new day on the frontier. Sunday sunrise unfolded like rose-colored silk across the Arizona territory, tinting every cactus spine and fence post a gentle pink. It was the last weekend of October 1885, and a thin hush already filled the Pritchett homestead. Nights had turned crisp. Pa's breath puffed white while he hauled kindling to the stove, careful not to let the door creak. For once, the quiet was on purpose. The idea had hatched the evening before, when Violet read aloud from an article in a month-old tombstone epitaph about a New England school that held silent Sabbath to teach patience. Daisy slapped the kitchen table, half teasing, half challenging. Reckon the 6 of us could keep our mouths shut sunup to sundown. Fern laughed so loud the lamp wick fluttered, but Rose, ever the arbiter of practicality, surprised them by nodding. Might be a fine way to let the land speak instead of us for a change. Pa shrugged. Words or no words, cows still needed hay. And so the vow was settled. From first light until the lamp was lit that night, not a syllable would leave a sister's lips. Sunday duties were lighter by tradition. No fence repairs, no field work, only the chores that protected animals and people alike. Silence, however, complicated even simple tasks. At dawn, Daisy stirred cornmeal mush while Lily pumped water. They choreographed each movement with raised eyebrows and tilted heads. Daisy's elbow bumped the tin coffee pot, nearly knocking it from the stove. Lily grabbed it in time, her grin wide but voiceless. The kitchen smelled of cedar smoke and boiling grounds, but nobody spoke to praise the aroma. Outside, the desert woke slowly. A horned lark trilled from the thorn bush near the well. Breeze whispered through dry sorghum cane. Without conversation to layer over those sounds, each creak of leather, each scuff of boot on hardpan seemed magnified. Violet spread Pa's patched Sunday vest on the porch rail to air out, her needle and thread tucked away for the day. She caught herself humming and clapped a hand to her mouth. The vow barred tunes as well. Fern, carrying a bucket of cracked grain for the chickens, stifled a giggle at the sight. Morning prayers took place on the kitchen's long pine bench. Pa read from Ma's worn Bible, his voice low enough to keep the calm intact. The sisters bowed heads. The only other sound was a fly buzzing the window until Violet shooed it away with a silent flick of her hand. After Amen, Pa closed the book, and the spell of muteness resumed. The Pritchett's nearest church stood 20 miles south in Fairbank, a wagon ride too long for most Sabbaths. On Silent Sunday, they stayed home, trading hymns for habits. Rose fetched her ledger, no rule against writing, and jotted a note about the hay loft needing patching before winter. She tapped the page twice to show Pa. He answered with a slow nod and returned to sipping coffee thick as river mud. By mid-morning, the sun climbed high enough to bake warmth back into the yard. Lily saddled her mellow gray mare to check stock in the east pasture, slipping a slate and chalk into her saddlebag so she could report any strays with marks instead of words upon her return. Fern volunteered, pantomiming request, to pump extra buckets for the cow and calf. Daisy, Iris, and Violet cleared breakfast dishes with the quiet efficiency of a clock's gears, passing plates hand to hand, stacking tin cups without clatter, sharing smirks each time habit tempted them to chatter. Silence stretched on, comfortable as thick wool. The desert, usually filtered by human talk, poured its own language into their ears. The click of grasshopper wings, the dusty sigh when a dust devil collapsed, the brittle crack of a mesquite pod under a boot heel. Even the hens seemed to respect the mood, clucking in subdued tones as they pecked shadows beneath the coop eaves. Without conversation, time felt syrup slow. Iris fetched her sketchbook and sat beside the water barrel, drawing the shape of Santa Rita Mountains on the southern horizon. Fern joined, doodling a lopsided rooster until Iris nudged her with a teasing elbow. Laughter quivered behind their pressed lips, but did not escape. High noon arrived with a shimmer of heat off the hardpan. Daisy served cold biscuits drizzled with sorghum syrup, setting the plate at the center of the table like a peace offering. Everyone ate in near-perfect peace, save when Pa, eyes twinkling, deliberately scraped his fork just to see who would crack first. 6 pairs of narrowed eyes scolded him until he chuckled, then lifted 2 fingers in mock surrender. He, too, fell silent. Afternoon chores were few. Pa oiled rifle parts on the porch, gearing up for the fall jackrabbit cull. Rose balanced household accounts with only the scratch of pencil as company. Lily returned from the pasture holding up her slate. All cows present. Fence fine. A round of relieved smiles answered, but still no voices. As the sun slid west, long shadows spilled across the yard. Violet lit the cook stove for supper, stirring beans with a wooden spoon. Steam rose, carrying hints of chili and garlic. She dipped her spoon toward Fern. Taste, and Fern obediently tried a sample, giving a thumbs up. No words needed. Evening crept in, the sky bruising purple above the basalt ridge. Coyotes started their call and answer across the arroyos. Somewhere a nightjar hooped. Pa lit one of Iris's homemade candles, setting it in the middle of the pine table. The soft glow painted every face amber. An unspoken question floated. Had they lasted? Rose glanced at the mantel clock. 8:15. The vow would end when the candle guttered. Minutes ticked. Wax melted, pooled, trembled. Finally, the flame fluttered and winked out, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. Lily exhaled the first deliberate sound. "Land sakes," she said, voice raspy from disuse. I could hear my own heartbeat half the day. Daisy laughed loud enough to shake dust from the rafters. Fern added a whoop. Iris stretched her jaw muscles, testing words. "I missed humming," she confessed. Violet grinned. "And I missed your humming," she said, giving Iris a playful bump. Pa leaned back, satisfied. "Quieter than usual," he noted, "but not by much." Rose closed her ledger with a neat snap. Silence didn't hush the desert, just gave it more room, she said. Around her the sisters nodded, each understanding that the hush had carried its own kind of conversation. The language of wind, hoof, and feather, spoken clear as any human tongue. The lamp was trimmed, shutters drawn against chilly air, and the Pritchett cabin filled with easy chatter once more. Outside, coyotes continued their song, but inside, the family's voices rose like friendly sparks, stitching sound back into the night. The vow of silence was over, leaving behind a memory as soft as the desert's early light and as steady as the bond that drew 6 sisters, Pa, and a wide, wild land together under one roof. The first amber light of November 1885 slipped over the low basalt ridge and spread across the Pritchett homestead like warm syrup. Mondays meant mail, at least in theory. A lone rider from Fort Huachuca was supposed to pass once every 2 weeks, saddlebags stuffed with letters and the tombstone epitaph folded into neat squares. Most runs arrived late, some never at all, But this morning the whole family woke hoping for news. Pa had a nephew back in Kansas battling a cough that wouldn't quit, and Fern had mailed a sketch of a desert quail to her pen pal in Tucson. Daisy claimed the honor of lookout. She wrapped her green-sprigged calico shawl tight, filled a mug with hot sorghum coffee, and took 3 wide steps to the split-rail fence at the edge of the yard. From there, the wagon track rolled south across open grassland all the way to the mission ruins at Sonoita. A sharper eye than Daisy's might have spotted the dust of a rider already, but the horizon lay still as paper. She planted her boots, leaned on the top rail, and began to wait. Behind her, the day settled into its regular heartbeat. Rose walked the northern fence, tapping staples tight with Pa's small hammer. Violet knelt by the porch rail, turning an old flour sack into dishcloths. Lily led the mare to water, pausing now and then to scan the distance herself. Each time she turned back empty-handed, Daisy lifted a friendly eyebrow. Any sign? Lily shrugged, gentle laughter in her eyes, but kept silent so the calm would hold. By 8 the sun floated high, drying frost off the sorghum stalks. Daisy shifted from one foot to the other and poured the lukewarm dregs of her coffee onto a patch of dust that needed tamping. She counted fence posts for the 10th time, 11 visible from that corner, then traced idle circles on the rail with her fingertip. A lone raven cruised overhead, cawing once before banking toward the Santa Ritas. Daisy pretended the bird carried a note in its beak, some clever message traveling faster than horse. Inside the cabin, Iris sliced apples for drying. When she carried the tin tray to the yard, she offered Daisy a sliver. Daisy shook her head. Hands free, she pantomimed, just in case the rider crested the ridge this very moment. Iris nodded and retreated, lips twitching. Mid-morning heat shimmered above the hardpan. A dust devil twirled to the east, but it spun itself out long before reaching the track. Rose returned from her rounds, sweat darkening her collar, and stood beside Daisy without speaking. 2 minutes later, she pointed north, hopeful. Daisy shaded her eyes, saw only a distant yucca waving like a sentinel, and sighed. Rose squeezed her shoulder, comfort enough, and headed inside for water. Time slowed into syrup. Daisy tried whistling at him, but stopped after 3 notes. Better to save breath. She reviewed every letter she hoped to read. Maybe Aunt Clara's promised recipe for peach preserves. Maybe the loco weed warning Pa's cousin had written about. Maybe nothing but blank pages and a handful of seed catalogs. Even seed catalogs would be welcome. The last one, so worn the cover had torn clean off, still propped the table leg in the kitchen. Near noon, Pa emerged carrying 2 tin plates of Johnny cake. He handed one to Daisy, then leaned on the rail and looked south with her. Ryder'll come when he's ready, he muttered, half apology, half philosophy. Daisy took a bite, crumbs scattering. They watched together until the sun crept another inch. Then Pa returned to the sorghum press. Early afternoon brought wind, a steady push from the southeast that rattled mesquite pods and lifted Daisy's curls. It also stirred a faint plume of dust on the far trail. Daisy's heart jumped. She pressed a palm above her eyes, certain she saw the darting flash of a bay horse. But the shape resolved into a pair of pronghorn antelope leaping the road, white rumps bobbing like handkerchiefs. Daisy exhaled through pursed lips, more amused than disappointed. The antelope bounded away, leaving the trail empty once more. Shadows lengthened, cool air chasing heat from the yard. Fern practiced him chords on the pump organ, and the soft notes drifted through the cabin window. They sounded like evening stars coming out too soon. Daisy rubbed stiff shoulders and wondered if a mail run skipped for bad stream crossings or if bandits had taken an interest in stamped envelopes. At last, when the sun balanced on the western rim, a different dust plume appeared, slow, measured, steady. Lily, out feeding the chickens, saw it too and waved her hat in a tight circle. Daisy's breath caught. This time the shape did not wobble into antelope or mirage. A horse's head broke the horizon. Rider hunched under the weight of saddlebags. Daisy clapped once, then forced herself still so she wouldn't spook mare or man with wild gestures. The courier reined in by the gate, tipped his hat, and slid 3 envelopes and a folded newspaper into Daisy's waiting hands. "Apologies for the delay," he said. "Rockslide at Sonoita Creek." Daisy could not have cared less. Paper crinkled under her grateful fingers. She thanked him, passed Pa's small coin payment, and watched until horse and rider melted north toward Tombstone. Inside, the family circled the table as Daisy sorted treasures. A letter stamped Topeka with Pa's nephew's neat hand, a Tucson envelope addressed to Fern in sprouting young script, and a seed catalog wrapped in brown paper. New edition, bright ink, smelling of printer's oil. The Tombstone epitaph carried headlines about silver mines and county elections, none urgent, but still sweet proof that the world spun beyond their fence lines. They read by candlelight, each paragraph relayed aloud while bean stew simmered. Daisy's muscles still ached from hours at the fence rail, yet warmth bloomed inside her chest. Waiting had been dull, yes, slower than molasses, but it delivered exactly what the frontier often taught. Patience could bridge distances even faster than a galloping horse. And tonight, thanks to dusty saddlebags and a rider's stubborn grit, the Pritchett cabin glowed brighter, full of words that had finally found their way home. Sun rose pale and dusty over the southeastern corner of the Arizona Territory, turning the hardpan yard into a sheet of pink copper. November 1885 had been dry as flint. No rain had kissed the Pritchett spread since the first week of September, and the well bucket had begun to clang a good bit farther before finding water. Pa worried the rope might be rubbing thin where it slid over the big cottonwood limb that served as a pulley. One snap of frayed hemp and the bucket would drop 60 feet, lost to the dark like a stone in a canyon. So this morning he handed Lily, the sister most at home with horses, ropes, and anything that squeaked or creaked, a coil of fresh hemp line and said, "Measure the well proper, cut a new length, and make sure the knot sits true. We can't afford a broken bucket." Lily, 26 and tall as a fence post herself, touched the brim of her hat in reply and set about the job. A task simple on paper often sprawled like a mesquite root once you got close. The Pritchett well sat behind the cabin, ringed by low stones Pa had hauled from a dry wash years back. A rawhide windlass, hewn from juniper, held the rope. The handle wobbled but still turned smooth. Rose finished noting yesterday's fence repairs in her ledger, then climbed the porch rail to watch. "Call if you need help," she said. Lily winked. "Just counting rope," her eyes seemed to answer. She tied one end of the new line to the iron ring bucket and began lowering, hand over hand, letting the rope slide steady. 10 feet, 15, 20. The cottonwood branch groaned softly overhead. 40 feet in, the well wall swallowed the bucket whole. Lily waited for the wooden clunk that meant the bucket had hit water. Nothing. She let out more line. 50 feet, 60. Finally, a hollow splash drifted up, faint as a pebble in a pond. She marked the rope with a bit of blue cloth, then hauled the bucket back. The crank squealed. Sweat dotted her forehead, though the morning still held a bite of cold. When the bucket cleared the lip, water sloshed bright against iron sides. Lily tugged the knot free and laid the rope straight on the packed earth. Fern, curious after hearing the squeal, wandered over with a biscuit in hand. "How deep is it?" she asked between bites. 62 feet, give or take," Lily said, measuring the rope against her stride. Fern whistled. "Deeper than last year. Water level must have dropped as the desert sun kept pulling moisture skyward." Daisy, busy mixing cornmeal batter near the open window, overheard and called that extra buckets would be wise before midday heat set in. Violet suggested splicing a second bucket to keep trips fewer. Iris, already plotting improvements, fetched her pocket knife to help. Lily's next step sounded easy. Trim the new coil to exactly the right length, plus 2 feet for tying, then wind it onto the windlass. But she wanted the knot snug against the bucket handle, not fat and lumpy where it might snag. She studied the rope end, rubbed pine pitch along the fray, and began a tight double hitch Pa had taught her. Halfway through, the windlass shifted and clacked, jerking the bucket, which knocked Lily's shin hard enough to make her hiss. The knot slipped. Rope slithered. Splash. The bucket and whole coil plunged, rattling stone, before vanishing into the well with a deep gulp. Fern gasped so loud Daisy's mixing spoon paused midair. Silence fell, broken only by the lonely whine of a far-off hawk. Lily's cheeks burned. "So much for careful," she muttered. Rose hopped down from the rail. "Holler for Pa?" Lily shook her head. She hated calling help before giving a thing her best swing. Instead, she fetched the thinner backup line kept coiled near the smokehouse. Frayed some, but still strong. and tied on a three-pronged meat hook. The plan: fish the fallen bucket out, pull the new rope back, and try again. Simple, again, though the well mouth looked suddenly as narrow as a coin slot. Violet arrived with the lantern used for chicken thief patrols. "Light might help," she whispered, lowering the lamp just far enough to paint the stone shaft amber. 60 feet below, metal winked beneath shifting ripples. Encouraged, Lily fed the hook down. It missed, swung, missed again. She tried from another angle. 10 minutes passed. Arms sore, she rested the hook against the stones while cooling her temper. Meanwhile, Iris hunted her gearbox, returning with a small bell tied to string. She fixed it above the hook so any contact would jingle. Smart thinking. Sound traveled up the shaft more willing than sight. Lily guided the hook once more. Faint metal rang below. She pulled. Resistance. Slowly, slowly, the bucket and soggy rope emerged, dripping a trail that soaked Lily's boots. Rose and Fern cheered in whispers. Daisy hissed from the window, not to spill excitement into the stew. Lily grinned sheepishly, set the rescued bucket upright, and wrung water from her braid. "Try two," she announced, fetching a second coil, this time older rope but strong. She measured twice, cut once, spliced ends with waxed thread, and tied a lean bowline that sat snug as a button. Everyone watched the new bucket descend. 10, 20, 40 feet. Splash. Lily cranked it back. Water rose clear to the brim. She tested the rope. No slip, no sag. Pa strolled over at last, wiping sorghum dust from his hands. "How goes the depth?" he asked. 62 feet, Lily answered, and one lesson learned about knots and impatience. Pa's eyes twinkled. "Wells deeper, you're wiser. Good trade." All afternoon, the sisters hauled bucket after bucket, filling the barrel for laundry day and topping troughs before heat thickened the air. The fresh rope glided smooth, the knot held. By sunset, the yard held neat rows of brimming pails that sparkled orange in dying light. Crickets tuned up, and the smell of Daisy's bean stew mixed with cool, damp notes rising off stone. During supper, Lily rubbed the faint bruise on her shin and told the tale of the plunging bucket. Fern acted the splash so vigorously she nearly upset her cup, sending laughter around the table. Yet underneath the joking hummed a quiet relief. Water, sure and steady, would be there come morning. Outside, stars stitched silver patterns above the well's dark mouth. The new rope curled tight around the windlass, waiting for next dawn's thirsty chores. And deep below, 62 feet, give or take, a bucket rested in silent water, proof that even a small tangle can be straightened if a person has patience, spare rope, and a little help from sisters who don't mind fishing in the dark. Gray dawn seeped through cabin chinks, and November chill curled across the floor like a shy cat. The Pritchett farm, tucked in the scrub flats a day's ride north of the Mexican line, had slipped into the quiet stretch between harvest and winter, when days felt longer than fence wire and excitement was measured in spoonfuls. On this particular morning of 1885, Rose pushed aside the ticking clock's 10 back and frowned at the date, November 19th. Time, she decided, for the annual pantry count before frost or forgetfulness stole one precious jar. The Pritchetts kept their food in a dugout closet off the kitchen, 3 stone steps leading to darkness cool enough to save fruit, spicy pickles, and Daisy's prized peach jam. The sisters called it the pantry, though turf walls and a dirt floor made it more cave than closet. Rose's plan was simple: list every jar, crock, and sack so Daisy could ration sweet treats through the lean months. Boring as bookkeeping, perhaps, but losing track out here could mean cornbread without syrup by springtime. She told Pa at breakfast. He nodded approval over a mug of scorched coffee, then left to patch sorghum press boards. Iris, sharpening a carving knife, offered to help. Violet volunteered too, reasoning she could mend shelf cloths while jars were off their purchase. Daisy claimed she'd join once batter for corn cakes was mixed. Lily and Fern, set on cleaning harness leather in the barn, pledged moral support and an extra lantern. By 8 o'clock, pale sun spilled across the kitchen table where Rose laid out her ledger, a stubby pencil, and a chipped enamel cup for tally pebbles. 1 pebble per counted container, so numbers stayed honest even if pages tore. Iris balanced a lantern on the lowest step, its flame turning pantry shadows amber. Damp earth smelled of onions, vinegar, and faint apple sweetness. They began on the top shelf. Jar after jar clinked as Iris lifted them into light. Pickled okra, green now fading to yellow. Summer tomatoes thick as paint. 2 squat crocks of spice-packed peaches, lids sealed with wax as smooth as pond ice. Rose wrote neat lines. Asterisk tomato preserve, 9 pints. Pickled okra, 6 pints. Spiced peach, 2 crocks asterisk. Violet cut fresh cotton strips to replace dusty shelf cloths, her needle darting like a minnow. Every so often she paused, stitched string through the hem, and hummed. A gentle sound swallowed quickly by earthen walls. Iris sniffed each jar for spoilage. None popped or clouded. Good news, but slow work. Outside, a north wind rattled mesquite pods. Through the window, Daisy's whisk scraped a bowl, cornmeal batter thickening for mid-morning cakes. Lily's low whistle drifted from the barn as she oiled harness buckles. Fern answered with a verse of sweet by and by, voice dancing around hammer taps. Down in the pantry, Rose shifted to the second shelf. Jars from early spring. Blackberry jam counted 7. Dandelion jelly, an experiment Iris had insisted would taste of sunshine, held only 1 small jar. Save that for Pa's cough, Iris whispered, grinning. Rose marked a star beside the entry. At the back lurked a forgotten jug of sorghum molasses, half full, crusted at the spout. Violet clicked her tongue. Sticky leak will tempt ants, she mouthed, and fetched a damp cloth. Rose eased cork free, wiped threads, and discovered granules hardened inside like brown glass. They'd warm the jug near the stove later, Iris suggested, melt sugar back to syrup. Just before 10, Daisy appeared with a plate of steaming corn cakes. She peered over Rose's shoulder, lips pursed at the numbers. Peach supplies thin, she murmured. Rationed to Sundays only. Rose wrote Sundays in the margin. Daisy plucked 2 small jars of wild grape jelly from a lower shelf, treasure for winter biscuits, and slipped upstairs again, leaving the warm smell of skillet bread behind. Back to counting. Salt pork brined in a red-striped crock weighed hefty in Iris's hands. Think we'll need 2 more of these next year, she said. Violet stitched a note on a scrap of muslin. More pork, spring slaughter. Into Rose's ledger it went. They saved sacks for last. Canvas bags of dry beans rested on a plank near the floor, each tied with blue string. Rose knelt, loosened the first knot, and scooped beans into her palm. Still hard, no weevil dust, safe. She scooped, weighed by feel, then jotted bean, pinto, half sack. Next came cornmeal. Only 1 full bag remained since Daisy's baking spree. Wheat flour sat low too, 1/3 barrel. Rose's pencil paused. Might be tight if rail wagons delay, she said quietly. Iris blew a breath, lantern light fluttering. We can grind sorghum seed if worst hits, Violet reminded, practical as always. At noon, Lily clomped down the steps, boots still smelling of saddle soap. She added her lantern's glow to the shelf, and suddenly the pantry shone bright, jars gleaming like rubies and topaz in the pooled light. Just in time, Iris said, passing Lily a jar to reshelf. They formed a line. Iris handed jars, Lily placed them, Violet smoothed fresh cloth, and Rose tallied each replacement, dropping a pebble into the enamel cup. Stone clicks echoed soft, a small music of completion. 3 clicks short, Rose scanned the ledger, brow wrinkled. 1 sack of dried apples missing, she said. A search started. Iris behind the woodbox, Violet under burlap sacks. Lily up the kitchen ladder to check rafters where Pa sometimes stashed treats. No apples. Daisy, hearing the rumble, remembered. We traded those to the Freeman family after their boy broke an arm, she called from the stove. Relief rippled. Rose crossed out the apples line and scribbled traded. By mid-afternoon, the pantry stood tidy, shelves straight, cloths fresh, jars shining. The enamel cup sat full, 107 pebbles, each meaning something set aside against hunger. Rose thumbed her ledger, pages now dense with numbers and small notes. Stretch molasses, grind sorghum if needed, Sunday peaches only. She felt a glow, dull perhaps, but steady as the lantern. Before supper, Pa stepped in from the chill, boots dusted white with dried creek silt. Rose handed him the ledger. He scanned, nodding at intervals, then closed the book and tapped its cover. Food enough, light enough, plans enough, he said. Winter can knock if it pleases. That evening, the sisters ate rabbit stew thickened with cornmeal dumplings, dessert a spoon of blackberry jam on hot biscuits, justified now that they knew exactly how many jars remained. The wind outside rattled shutters. In the stove a pine knot popped, sparks dancing up the flue. Rose rested the ledger on the mantel, pages cooling by the fire. A pantry count might rank alongside counting fence posts or threading a stubborn needle. All quiet chores that seldom earn a place in dime novels. Yet each small inventory stitched the Pritchett world tighter, row by row, jar by jar. And when the first winter frost crept low across the desert flats, that ledger full of tidy numbers would feel warmer than any blanket, promising the family good eating straight through to spring bloom. Thin ice glazed the water barrel the first morning of December 1885, and Pa's breath puffed like steam as he eased open the cabin door. Winter had tiptoed into the southern Arizona territory, not with heavy snow, but with long nights that swallowed kerosene faster than the family could haul freight from Tucson. When dawn finally nudged the horizon, Violet stood on the porch rail, chimney brush in one hand, a neat bundle of cotton cord wicks in the other. Every lamp on the Pritchett place, 7 indoors, 2 barn lanterns, a stub-nosed hand torch, needed attention. Foggy chimneys wasted light, and ragged wicks burned twice as fast. None of it was difficult, but it was fussy, finger-numbing work that had to be done before chores scattered the sisters to fence lines and feed troughs. Violet, 22 and keeper of all things sewn or trimmed, had claimed the job the night before with a quiet, "I'll see to the lamps. We'll want clear glass once the evenings stretch." The cabin sat a day's ride northwest of Tombstone, where nights came sharp and stars burned so bright they seemed to crack the dark. Out here a lantern meant more than comfort. Trimmed wicks guided Pa home from the sorghum press, kept Daisy's biscuits from scorching, and let Lily read dime novels to Fern after supper. If a chimney soot over, shadows bunched in corners like coyotes circling a campfire. Violet laid her tools on the porch table, a bone-handled knife, the wire chimney brush, a rag dipped in vinegar, and a tiny tin of lampblack for sealing cracks. Rose appeared first, ledger tucked beneath one arm. She offered a steaming cup of sorghum coffee and a simple nod, approval without words, then disappeared to tally feed sacks. Violet started with the dining table lamp. She loosened the brass gallery, slid the soot-clouded chimney free, and held it toward the newborn sun. The glass looked like a fogged window. She slipped the brush inside, 3 quick twists, then wiped the rim with the vinegar rag until the glass shone clear as creek water. Next came the wick. She snipped the charred tip into a neat half-moon, the shape Pa said burned brightest. Daisy patted in, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're a wonder," she whispered, careful not to jostle Violet's hand. She fetched the stovetop lamp, sooty from last night's stew, and traded it for the clean one. Behind her iris stoked cedar splints under the griddle, sparks snapping like colt hooves on hardpan. By the time golden stripes of light pooled on the porch boards, Violet had 4 chimneys gleaming upside down on a towel, each warming like sunlit jars. Cold nipped her fingertips, yet the steady rhythm, unscrew, brush, wipe, trim, kept her mind calm, almost drowsy. Outside, a desert wren stitched song through gray sage. In the distance, Rose's hammer ticked against a fence post. Barn lanterns came next. Lily carried them from the tack room, the smell of saddle soap trailing behind. Barn dust clung to every groove. One lantern had a hairline crack snaking across its base. Violet dabbed lampblack along the wound, smoothing it with a thumb until the seam vanished beneath the oily black. "Might buy us another month," she mouthed. Lily answered with a thumb up and strode off to bridle the mare. Fern arrived last, half in, half out of her coat, clutching Pa's stub-nosed torch used for nocturnal coyote patrols. Its wick resembled a frayed rope's end. "Think it'll live?" she mouthed, respecting the early hush. Violet trimmed away the ragged threads, rolled a fresh cotton strip through the brass tube, and primed it with a single drop of kerosene. When she struck a match, the flame stood tall and blue at the core, strong as noon sun. Fern beamed, hugging the torch against her coat before racing off to count chickens. Mid-morning chill began to lift. 9 lamps sat in a row on the porch rail, chimneys sparkling like ice, wicks cut even, reservoirs topped. The family would hardly notice, Violet knew, Light was something folks missed only when it failed. Still, a quiet pride warmed her palms. She gathered the sooty rags, the spent wick ends, and the empty vinegar cup and stepped inside just as Daisy set cornbread batter on the stove. Pa entered, shoulders dusted white with cane flour. He paused, squinting at the row of bright chimneys. "Looks like stars trapped in glass," he said. Violet flushed. Praise from Pa was rare as a desert rainbow. He lifted one lamp, cranked the wick, and struck a match even though daylight flooded the room. The flame glowed steady, no flicker, no smoke. He nodded once, returned the lamp, and went to wash up. That evening, dusk slid over the flats quicker than anyone liked. When Daisy lit the first lamp, the chimney flared clear, filling the cabin with amber that seemed almost liquid. Rose added another near the ledger desk. Its light spilled across neat columns of numbers, no soot coiling upward. Out in the barn, Lily's lantern shone perfect circles onto the mare's flank while she brushed winter dust from the gray's coat. After supper, Fern practiced a hymn on Ma's old pump organ. Iris sketched the silhouette of the Santa Ritas in her notebook. Violet sat near the hearth, needle flashing as she hemmed a dish towel. Each stitch caught the lamplight, tiny sparks dancing off silver. No one mentioned the lamps, yet every face glowed soft and clear, eyes unshadowed. Outside, coyotes howled at a crescent moon, but inside, 9 small suns held darkness firmly at the door. Later, when the house settled and Pa banked the stove, Violet made one last round, turning wicks down, checking chimneys for fresh soot, setting barn lanterns on the porch to cool. She stepped into the yard, breath misting the crisp air, and tipped her head back. Above, real stars burned fierce across the desert vault. Below, their glass cousins rested, ready for tomorrow's long night. It struck her how both kinds of light mattered, each chasing its own stretch of dark. On a homestead where stories were measured in fence posts, corn shucks, and jars of jam, a morning spent trimming wicks would never make a headline. Yet its glow lingered long after flames were turned low, threading comfort through every corner of the cabin. Boring perhaps, but in the wide, wild territory, small steady lights were how a family found its way, night after night, until dawn returned to paint the hardpan yard pink once more.